This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Michael Eury. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, one of the two guys with PhDs talking about comics. And on this interview episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Michael Eury. His new book, Hero-a-Go-Go, Campy Comic Books, Crimefighters and Culture of the Swinging Sixties, comes out next week from TwoMorrows Publishing. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes it's 50% off cover, but every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And since I will be talking with Michael Eury, it's worth pointing out that if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you can find his Batcave Companion on sale for 25% off of the cover price. So you can get it for only $20.21 at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Derek sent you. Next week, Michael Eury's 14th book of nonfiction, Hero-a-Go-Go, Campy Comic Books, Crimefighters and Culture of the Swinging Sixties, will be coming out from TwoMorrows Publishing. Michael is the Eisner Award-nominated editor-in-chief of TwoMorrows Back Issue magazine. He's worked as a writer or editor for a variety of comics companies, including DC Comics and Dark Horse Comics. His other works include Captain Action, the original superhero action figure, Dick Giordano, Changing Comics One Day at a Time, Comics Gone Ape, and a variety of reference works for TwoMorrows, including the Krypton Companion, the Batcave Companion, and the Justice League Companion. It was a pleasure talking with Michael, especially since he is a fellow native North Carolinian, and we grew up in the same general area and to some degree experienced some of the same culture that he writes about in Hero-a-Go-Go. Now, we have a fun time in this conversation, but let me mention something here. About 48 minutes into the interview, Michael's phone ran out of juice, and so we had to switch phones. So a little after 48 minutes, you will hear a slight change in the sound of his voice. Nothing happened to his voice. It was just that he went to another phone, and we finished our conversation. I think you'll really like this, so let's go ahead and start listening to it now. I'm pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Michael Eury. His new book, Hero-a-Go-Go, Campy Comic Books, Crimefighters and Culture of the Swinging Sixties, comes out next week from TwoMorrows Publishing. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Derek. I'm happy to be here.
And I'm happy to be talking with you not only about this book, but you're a fellow North Carolinian, a native North Carolinian.
Okay, well, wonderful. Where were you born and raised?
Not too far from where you were born and raised, and that is Charlotte.
Oh, yes, I know it well. It's kind of hard not to know Charlotte if you're living in nearby Concord, since Charlotte provides most of the television media and radio media, et cetera, to this community, and always has. When I grew up in the 60s, a lot of the stuff that I wrote about, the cartoons and such in Hero-a-Go-Go, I viewed on Charlotte television stations.
Wow, and I'm sure we saw some of the same things maybe at the same moment.
Maybe we did. Maybe we did.
Well, let's talk about this new book, Hero-a-Go-Go, and I mean, I can guess, given your other works that you've done, but for telling our listeners, what is the genesis of this project? What is it about the 1960s camp and comics culture that drew you to this subject?
Well, I have to credit another TwoMorrows publication for planting the seed for my wanting to do this book. A little over a year or so ago, Mark Boger published Monster Mash through TwoMorrows, and it was excuse me, a beautiful celebration of the monster craze of the 50s and 60s. And when I started to flip through that, I thought, gee, I'd really like to do a similar treatment of the camp era, because that was my childhood, for better or for worse. The Batusiing Batman and all the silly stuff. I mean, even the sitcoms of the era were just absurd, but they were lovable. Gilligan's Island and Green Acres, Hogan's Heroes. I mean, who would have thought that a concentration camp could have sustained a weekly sitcom, much less even, been the subject of a sitcom in the first place? But that was the 60s. I mean, I think just because the real world had so many dark issues clouding us, that pop culture, whether it was a concerted effort or not, definitely went in the opposite direction and just gave us, wild and fun and goofy stuff and bubblegum music. And the spies back then were swinging, and it just was, as far as the pop culture and the entertainment were concerned, a lighthearted time.
Yeah, and I was asking about your interest in comics culture, but one of the things that you do in Hero-a-Go-Go is that you look at this phenomena, these trends, within a larger media landscape. So, I mean, yeah, you do a lot of focusing on comics, but you also look at other media, especially television and even film, especially when there's this crossover effect where you have a TV show that gets its own title in comics, many times by Dell or Gold Key, or you have, let's say, a comic book character that becomes a toy or vice versa. So, I mean, you bring in various facets of the culture of the time. You don't just stick with the comic books.
That's very true. Essentially, if you're looking at the camp movement, you can't look just at comic books. I think people are prone to do that because of Batman and its success with the television show. But again, it was a television show which really fed the popularity of the comic books of that day. So everything during that era seemed to be drinking the same Kool-Aid, from the sitcoms to the music. Jan and Dean meet Batman. The surfing duo decides to do a comedy concept album. And that really was, as readers will discover when they read my interview with Dean Torrance, who is the Dean in Jan and Dean, they'll discover that Jan and Dean was really starting to embark upon a different direction. They really wanted to do, the type of comedy you would later see on Saturday Night Live. And this concept album, Jan and Dean Meet Batman, was just that. However, an accident that Jan sustained derailed their plans. They even had a TV show in the works that would have been sort of like the Monkees before the Monkees. And so all of that went south, unfortunately. But superheroes and campy characters and spies. I mean, a lot of the people who had variety TV shows on during the 60s were doing spoofs of these things as well. So it was a virus I was pleased to catch. And the camp virus really infected America for quite a few years in the mid-60s.
Yeah, at what point in the 1960s do you see camp beginning to fizzle out, and then at what point can we call our culture, for all practical purposes, camp-free? I
think the camp-free culture, well, it obviously started to fizzle with the cancellation of Batman in 1968 after its third season. And, we say Batman was a 3-season show. Technically, it was 3 seasons, but 2.5 seasons because it was a mid-season replacement in the 65-66 season as it debuted in January of 66. So that was a phenomenal hit, but again, like any other phenomenal hit, they generally will run out of steam and implode under their own weight. And that's kind of what happened there with the cancellation of Batman, because so many people had jumped on that bandwagon that there's just no way that the market could continue to sustain that much of the same flavor. And so I would say 68 was when it really started to fade. There were a few other things that were happening around that time that were still very campy. But, as far as the Batman, to use him as an example again is concerned, it was around 69 that they started this slow darkening process of the character at DC Comics, really in an effort to kind of hose off the camp era from it, which they had embraced a couple of years earlier because it was making millions for everybody. But then when that was passé, it was time to move on to something else. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was really coming of age around 68 or so into the early 70s. And I sort of call that like the last stalwart of the camp era because it was very campy, but it was also sort of cutting edge in the regard that it was dealing with sharp political humor and maybe even a little bit of cynicism that you really wouldn't think would have evolved until Watergate, but nonetheless, they did that wink, wink, nudge, nudge type thing too, and it was very sexy and bawdy for American television at the time.
Yeah, and speaking of Watergate, with Laugh-In, they even got Richard Nixon. Absolutely. I give a little nod to that at the end of my essay in Hero-a-Go-Go on Super Presidents, which is essentially a look at JFK and LBJ in comic books. Because Kennedy was lionized in comics, as you would expect. But even prior to his assassination, Mort Weisinger, the editor of Superman comics, he was a diehard Democrat, and he hobnobbed with a lot of people in high circles. And he put Kennedy in frequent cameos in his Superman books. And it really got to be like, I almost thought there would be a comic, Superman's presidential pal, John F. Kennedy, but that never happened. But he was in so many stories. But then, conversely, Johnson, when Johnson was sworn in after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson was played for laughs, and maybe his appearance really fed into that because he was sort of cartoonish, that big nose and the big ears. And the ears,
and the Texas drawl. I mean, these things were inviting parody. But no one dared put JFK in a superhero suit, or if they did, I've never seen that. And Johnson was Super LBJ in 2 different incarnations, including one that I do a lot of coverage on in the book, The Great Society comic book, which was really released for adults in 1966. It was done by D.J. Arneson and Tony Tallarico. And there are copies of that in the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, the reading that section, Super Presidents, JFK and LBJ in comic books, got me to thinking that, since those two, I really don't think we've had the kind of coverage within comics of presidents, the representation, either parodic or otherwise, until Barack Obama.
I think you could be right. Yeah. Reagan did make a lot of cameos.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Even in DC's crossover legends, Reagan was definitely a major player. Mm-hmm. And additionally, wasn't he? Watchmen. No, that was Nixon.
That was Nixon
was
right.
Perpetually president, in Watchmen. So a few presidents have popped in, none more infamously than Nixon in Steve Englehart's Secret Empire storyline of Captain America, where it turns out that Nixon is the arch villain of the entire piece.
Right.
But Obama was definitely embraced by the comic book world, and that classic Spider-Man issue, making him an alternate reality Superman at DC, and then tons of other cameos here and there, and Obama also as a one-time Spider-Man and Conan reader. I remember that in the press, the fan press in particular, when he was first elected, kind of made him ripe for the medium. I haven't really seen anybody do anything with Trump yet.
Outside of political cartoonists.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, we'll see if that happens, if President Trump starts to appear in contemporary comic books. But, I just think that those two particular presidents of the camp age, though, were semi-regulars in quite a few comics. And, Herbie would pop in on both JFK and LBJ as well. So,
Herbie the Fat Fury.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great character. I need to get those archive editions that Dark Horse has published. I think that's a great way to preserve those stories, and those are some that deserve to be preserved. With Hero-a-Go-Go, I've looked at all kinds of stuff and read tons of comics, and I'm glad I did. It was a lot of fun. A handful of them are really tough, just because they weren't very good. But I don't try to, or don't intend to treat any of the material with disrespect in the book. I actually treated it with a tremendous amount of affection. But then, looking back at a lot of the stuff that I read as a child in the 60s, looking back today through the lens of, whatever degree of wisdom I've managed to gather over the years, and also with some degree of intellectual curiosity, now I understand, certain things that were happening in the pop culture or the political landscape that contributed to this or that in those 60s comic books. Back then, I didn't get it because I was too young.
Now, you were mentioning the kind of reading that you were doing for this book. Tell me a little bit about the research that went into this and some of the challenges in actually going back and finding the original material.
Some of it was difficult to find. I basically, through eBay and a number of local, Charlotte and Concord, North Carolina related comic conventions, going through, reader copies and finding copies of some of the stuff to find, really higher grade copies of some of this material would be prohibitively expensive. So I bought a bunch of readers. John Morrow, my publisher too, he had been wanting to publish a book on the camp culture comics for years and had also been collecting a lot of this stuff, he told me. So he sent me a care package as well, a big box of comics that I borrowed from him to read. But again, I did get a lot, and I actually already had quite a few of these things too, particularly Batman and Batman-related stuff, because that was my introductory point into comics, really was the Batman craze of the 60s. So I read a ton of comics. I also sought out some of the paperbacks that were published during that era. Mm-hmm. And I started to watch a lot of cartoons. Some of them I had on DVD collections. Some I did a lot of YouTubing, watching 60s cartoons, and then listening to music. Music is also part of the landscape there. My fifth and final chapter in the book is Bandcamp, which is essentially about how the pop music and teenage culture participated in the camp movement, and also how they affected comic books. And so, again, this is, as you said earlier, the book itself really is a look at comic books, but not exclusively, since there was this, this hybrid type material that was taking place during the time. So I listened to a lot of music, particularly the Monkees and the Cowsills. And those were my two favorite bands from my childhood. I loved their music. A lot of people today won't know who the Cowsills are. but they were the Partridge Family before there was a Partridge Family. In the 60s, they were a family band. And yeah, I mean, the mom sang with the band. And as the legend goes, a few years after their big success in the 60s, there was a movement to turn them into a family sitcom, but they really wanted it as a vehicle for Shirley Jones. And so they wanted to have the Cowsills kids, but with Shirley Jones as their mom, and the family sort of nixed that idea. So they essentially created the Partridge Family whole cloth. But I didn't realize until listening to the Cowsills music some, 50 years after I did as a child, that how much the Partridge Family ripped them off. I mean, not just the concept, but the sound, the orchestrations, the harmonies that the family had. The Partridge Family just they they did it. They replicated it. And I mean, I liked the Partridge Family too. But then when I was I was starting to inch into my teens at that time, I liked that music. But it was just great to go back and revisit that. Personally, I now look back, let's see, 4 weeks ago my mother passed away. And so during much of, thank you, I appreciate that. But during much of the research and writing of this book, when I was essentially reliving the joys of my childhood, my mother was on this decline toward her passing. And now it just dawned on me a couple of days ago that this was healing. It was comforting also to go through this material, because overall I had a pretty charmed childhood. I had loving parents. I had a stable home. We didn't have a lot, but I never went hungry. I had comics. My dad would buy comic books for me. I was my creative arts interests were always indulged and encouraged. And wow, what a blessing that was. And so I really have to say that Hero-a-Go-Go was this love letter to my childhood. And it's a childhood that was largely predicated upon the love and the just good role models that that my parents provided for me. So it was just a blast to be able to go back and look at this stuff from a different perspective, but also just look at it nostalgically as well. When my mom was on this slow decline, and it was just difficult to watch. It's just very tough to see a loved one in that condition. And I mean, you know where it's going. I mean, this is all part of life, but nonetheless, you're having to experience it. And then with her case, it was dementia. And so she was just, kind of a pale imitation of what she was. But I mean, I included Mom in one of my essays. My mother took two of my buddies and me to the Charlotte Coliseum in 1967 to see the Monkees.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, how cool is that to cart 3 9-year-old boys on a work night, into Charlotte. And we, well, that was special. So little memories like that, popped up. And I basically structured the book as a collection of essays. And some of the essays have some personal asides, not in a, hopefully they're not, self-indulgent. I really try to capture universal experiences that a lot of people will remember. There's an essay on Batman as the spokesperson for All-Star Dairies. I mean, Batman was so heavily merchandised in 1966 and 67 that a dairy and milk and ice cream company that basically provided a brand for smaller dairies throughout the United States, a unified brand. They had to deal with D.C., and so they had Batman ice cream and, orange juice and all this stuff they were packaging. But what they were doing was providing like Batmobiles in small-town USA for their Christmas parades, and Batman would be right there in your hometown. I saw Batman, drive the Batmobile in Concord, North Carolina, which back then was a city of 18,000 people. So, wow, Batman came to my town. Now, as I look at the photo that I shared in the book, it was it was really the company car customized as the Batmobile, and there was some poor schmuck in the car driving it with a ski mask and oven mitts and a towel around his neck. But still, when you're 8 or 9 years old, you're a little less discerning, and you see the bat symbols and all this stuff, and wow, there's the Batmobile, son. I'm sure my dad was saying something like that. So I tried to capture those types of nostalgic, memories that people would have shared back during the era.
Yeah, you mentioned the nostalgic aspect of this book, and you and I are, I guess, generally around the same age, and so we grew up in the same area, and some of these things I definitely remember. I mean, Batman in 1966 to 68, I definitely remember watching those as a very little kid. And, you mentioned the Monkees, but, now that you also mentioned the Cowsills, I can't help but have the theme to Love American Style in my head. And I don't think it'll get out for a while, but yeah. Those are, those are all, really defining moments of many of our childhoods, the various pop cultural references, comics, TV, music, merchandise, whether it be toys or things like milk, ice cream, that defined our childhood. And do you think, let me ask the question this way. Did you write with a particular audience in mind? Let's say individuals who grew up in the same era as you and I did, or were you also attempting to reach out and maybe introduce that time, that culture to younger readers?
Well, yes, to both questions. Definitely my demo for this, the demographic is most certainly 50-somethings, because I think the people who grew up during that era and embrace these characters as their childhood icons and heroes, those are the people I primarily wrote to. But as I try to do with everything I write, I remember this old dictum that used to be preached to us when I was a comic book editor, that every issue is someone's first. Mm-hmm. And so I do not want to write in a fashion that would exclude anyone from understanding what my message is. And so there are a number of cases throughout the book where I would even just very briefly explain the historical significance or something, just in case somebody came in late. I think because some of these characters are perennials, there might be some interest from someone who was born well after the camp age, as I call it, to read this or read at least parts of it. So, I did not want to exclude anyone. I didn't want anyone to, if anyone's scratching their head when reading the book, hopefully it's from a reaction to like, well, why did they do that one in the first place instead of, not understanding what I'm trying to say? Like one of the biggest wrong turns that I cover in the book is Black Hawk, the junk hero. Yeah, I mean, if anybody's listening to this and doesn't know Black Hawk, long story short, Black Hawks, the Black Hawks, plural, were, although they were in a series called Black Hawk because the main character was Black Hawk, but it was World War II flying aces, and it was a war comic. And however, it was a popular one, though, that lived after World War II and was still being published in the 60s, and so they didn't know what to do with these characters who, were really just from a different generation. And so there was a very wrong turn made by writer Bob Haney, my favorite writer in comics of all time, I will say. He wrote all these Brave and the Bold team-ups that I just loved during my youth, teaming Batman with other characters. But he was also continuity blind and tone deaf to anything going on in any other book. He would do anything he'd want to do. And if he needed Batman and a Brave and the Bold story to ski or scuba dive or, flash a police badge, all this stuff, it would happen. But with Black Hawk, he was writing Black Hawk and made a noble experiment here, an attempt to contemporize the characters by making them superheroes, but then he called them junk heap heroes by having the Justice League, particularly Batman, go meet with LBJ to say these guys are has-beens. So they start to put them through test. And it's just kind of sad. I mean, I had never read those particular issues prior to my research. So I only approached those. I mean, if I did as a kid, I do not remember them. I remember the house ads. However, I don't remember actually reading the comics until last year. And it was painful. It was really painful because the characters got put through trials, but they were ridiculed along the way. And even the covers made fun of the characters, like, almost like, this has been, he's washed up. And I think they did that with the intention of creating some air of mystique or excitement. But ultimately, they just kind of branded these poor schmucks as schmucks. And that was one of these things that was just really one of the wrong turns that I cover in the book. But I still try to do so with a little bit of affection and fun. And, I've got some stinkers on my resume too. So it all, nobody sets out to do a bad comic or a bad movie, bad TV show, whatever. Sometimes things just don't work out. And I think that was one where we can look back through the perspective of hindsight and say, they maybe should not have done that one.
Yeah. Now you've talked about some of these chapters throughout the book. Let's tell our listeners that the way that this book, Hero-a-Go-Go, is organized, I think it makes a lot of sense. You've got 5 chapters. The first one is called Campfire, which basically is where you deal with what you call the superhero explosion of the last part of the 1960s. The second chapter is called Camptown Revivals, where this is really interesting, the number of older heroes or titles or series that creators and publishers attempted to bring back, not very successfully. The third chapter, Campus Clowns, you deal with spoofs and comedians who have appeared in comics. Then there's Camp Run-Amok, where you deal with larger media, so media heroes of the camp age. And then finally, you wrap up with the aforementioned Band Camp, where you look at music and bands of the 1960s and their place in camp. And I think that each one of those not only cleverly titled, but nicely encapsulates what you do in each section. It allows you to organize things, but in a panoramic manner.
Well, thanks. I appreciate your realizing that, because that's exactly the thought that I put into this. When I started looking at this, that structure obviously came to me after I was doing my research. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to categorize these chapters, but then once I started to really take in the material, then those 5 groupings became very clear to me. I think that probably, I could flip through the book and tell you for sure, but just from memory, probably I know the 2 longest sections, the 2 longest chapters are 3 and 4. The spoofs, there were just so many of them, and there a lot of them were really, really fun. Some of them are, weak when I look back at them today. Some of them were pretty darn funny, and really withstood the test of time. And then the chapter 4 about the media characters, and I really cover the gamut there, from the spies, from James Bond to all the TV spies, such as Man from U.N.C.L.E. and even Get Smart. Then there's Saturday morning cartoons, Hanna-Barbera characters. There's a lot of material in chapter 4, and that one was a little more of a challenge to figure out how to do that material. And whereas earlier and later, certain topics have their own essays, but there's an essay on, the Filmation superheroes, for example, the DC characters. There's a Filmation on the Marvel TV superheroes of the 60s. There's a Saturday Morning Heroes section that looked at a lot of the characters from Underdog and such. So, I structured them in a fashion to where they ended up being a little more like lively encyclopedia entries rather than essays on each one. But I really tried to dig up material from reading from a variety of sources and interviews and such that would be able to, pack this book with a lot of trivia and history that people may not know. Mm-hmm. And so that's the interesting thing. And there were a lot of discoveries that I made along the way too. And I've been, living and eating and breathing this stuff for a long time, and particularly through the other pop culture and comics history books I've done with TwoMorrows and a few other publishers. And then I've been editing Back Issue magazine for 14 years now. And so I've just picked up a lot. And the best way to pick up things is when you have the benefit of actually interviewing someone, or at least reading an interview with someone who was there and had their fingers in this stuff, and get the stories behind the stories. And so,
and you do a number of interviews for this book.
I do, yeah. I wanted to do that to kind of really just fold in their perspectives. And I sought out a number of people. I did send a query to Adam West, and I didn't get an interview with him, which I'm sorry, but he's been interviewed about Batman a lot. So actually that freed me up to, with all due respect to him, and he's my one of my two heroes, with Christopher Reeve as Superman as the other. And I have on my introduction, and page 3 or 5, whatever in the book, there's an autographed picture to me from Adam West. So I will always sing his praises. But nonetheless, that freed up a little space for me to approach a few people who might not have had a spotlight under other circumstances. One of the things that I really, really enjoyed the interviews is with Bob Holliday, who played Superman on Broadway. And he died early this year, which means this is his last interview, which is a great honor for me. But it's also, something that's, tinged with sadness here, too, that he didn't get to read this because he read it in a transcript form, but he didn't see the layout and the final product. And I just find that unfortunate because he was really happy to be included. Now, he's been interviewed in the past in retrospectives on Superman, and I just heard a replay of one on NPR this past Sunday where I heard him sing, from his Broadway show. But at this point, though, he thanked me for including him because I think he felt overlooked to some degree because he was the Superman of the 60s. I think most people who would think of the camp era would probably think of maybe the Filmation cartoon version of Superman as the Superman of the 60s, at least for the mass culture. But if you look at it from the person who played Superman, it would be him. And Bob Holliday played Superman more than anyone else, even George Reeves, just due to the number of performances he did as that character on stage. And he just was thrilled to be included in this mix. And as I mentioned earlier, Dean Torrance with Jan and Dean Meet Batman, he just opened up to me. I spoke with him for maybe 2.5 hours.
Wow.
It was an amazing phone call, and I had to really work on trimming that down to get it into print. But nonetheless, it's a fascinating read. Ralph Bakshi. Bakshi had his fingerprints on 3 different things in the camp era cartoons. The first was The Mighty Heroes, which was this hilarious spoof that was part of the Mighty Mouse show on CBS. And he tells a story of how that happened, and he kind of created that show in a pitching meeting by the seat of his pants. And that's the one that had Diaper Man. That's the character that everybody remembers that was voiced by Herschel Bernardi. If anybody who listens to this who knows who Herschel Bernardi is, he had a kind of a gruff voice. So that voice and a diaper wearing, bottle wielding superhero was just absolutely hilarious. He sounded like a 3-pack a day smoker, and the voice was totally wrong for the character, but that was the sheer irreverence of it. And they were doing this on Saturday mornings, and it was just really funny and over the top. But then Bakshi worked on Rocket Robin Hood. And the Spider-Man cartoon of the 60s, all of those are covered in the book. So I interviewed them. A few other people who are actually in the comic book world, like Ramona Fradon, who was the artist of Metamorpho, and she talked about the creation of that character and working with Bob Haney, and a little bit about what it's like to be a woman in a male-dominated business back then, but primarily about the character of Metamorpho. And Metamorpho is he's one of my favorite characters of all time, and he was just so weird. Really, he was kind of a blend of a superhero and a monster, at least in appearance. But he just had a really good attitude.
Yeah.
He wasn't like the Thing. The Thing was a perpetual pity party. Woe was me as the downtrodden monster who was trapped in that body. Well, so was Rex Mason. Even though he wanted to be human again, he accepted his fate. And while he always hoped to be restored to his normal state, he dealt with it, and he still had the girl. And so I just loved that character, and there was just this energy to it that Metamorpho, the book, that was unlike anything else that DC was publishing. The legend is that Stan Lee loved it too and offered Bob Haney a chance to go write for Marvel Comics, which Haney declined. I'm not sure if that is true, but it's a pretty cool story nonetheless.
Yeah. Well, a couple things that I wanted to ask you about, and also definitely worth mentioning about this book, is that you point out at the very beginning that even though when people hear the word camp, especially within the context of the 1960s, they immediately think of the Batman television show. And that makes sense. But you point out that camp doesn't begin there, that what we call camp actually has roots much earlier on. And so you do give attention to some of those, let's say, cultural tendrils in comics and otherwise that eventually led to something like a Batman television series.
Absolutely. As you're saying, camp predated Batman. I mean, even camp really goes back to early stage and vaudeville, screwball comedies. So it has been around. It just really took root in the 60s. And again, and as I write in my introduction, there really did seem to be a movement. I know it wasn't calculated at all to create more and more of these zany, campy properties to give people an escape from the realities of the Vietnam War, the protest, the civil rights demonstrations, how so many of them were turning so ugly and violent, generally no fault of the people who were out protesting. They were doing it peacefully. It was just a bleak time. One of my earliest memories, that's etched into my memory forever, is as a child having on our coffee table at my home the Life magazine that had that Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of that poor Vietnamese girl naked, running in abject terror, scalded with napalm burns. And this was the stuff that we saw, growing up in that time. You know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. It was on the news. You'd sit down with Huntley and Brinkley if you had the news on while you were having your, at your dinner hour or whatever, and you were seeing people get bombed.
Yeah, we were watching that on what, WSOC?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Exactly, or WBT, whatever, in the Charlotte market, and so that was what we grew up with. The headlines, I remember I remember being afraid when Martin Luther King was assassinated, being here in North Carolina as a child. That took place in Memphis, and his assassin James Earl Ray was on the lam for a while. I had this fear that he was going to kick the door in our house and hold us hostage. Now, that was a stupid thing that a kid would be afraid of, but I mean, we had a lot to be scared of back then, as people would do today. But what we had back then, we had this wonderful warm blanket of camp and bubblegum music and just happy, fun, happy-go-lucky media out there. And we had an escape net, and that was wonderful. Was it to be taken seriously? No, but there was plenty to take seriously, and the adults, our parents, they had a lot to shoulder back then, and I think they deserved their Laugh-Ins and their Batmans and their Green Acres to take a load off at the end of the day and just have some chuckles and put their minds on the shelves and leave all this other stuff behind. So, yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to ask you about in this book is you mentioned Stan Lee earlier. In reading through Hero-a-Go-Go, one of the things that just really leapt out at me was the fact that while Marvel does have a presence here, it's rather a minimal one compared to other publishers. I mean, obviously there's a lot of DC in this book, given their Batman property and other things that they were doing in the 1960s. Both with the superhero stuff, but also the comedy comics with Jerry Lewis and Bob Hope, things of that sort. So there's that. And yeah, we do have Dell and Gold Key represented quite a bit because of the adaptations from the televisions and television shows and films. But Marvel doesn't really come up much. I mean, yeah, with the animation, perhaps with characters, for instance, Action Man costumes included some Marvel characters. But why do you think it is that when it comes to camp, Marvel is underrepresented, or at least just wasn't there in the same way that some of these other businesses and publishers were?
Well, I purposely did not include much Marvel because as I was really looking at the comics of, I mean, these are also comics of the Silver Age of comics. Marvel has been represented so much in other books, but I will argue, and I'm really glad you asked me that question, I will argue that most of Marvel's 60s output really was not campy. There was this verve, this jazziness that Marvel had that other people tried to emulate, and I don't think they did it as well as Stan Lee did it naturally with his voice. And so these other people and their interpretations of this really ended up being campy to where I don't think Marvel really was that much. Now, camp in its purest definition also means something that, is embraced by adults as well. I mean, Batman had a dual audience of adults and children. And I remember getting mad at my parents when they were laughing at stuff that I thought was serious. But nonetheless, there was a growing, college campus audience for Marvel's properties during the 60s, but those stories were still treating they were really kind of postmodern in a way. They were treating their characters realistically. I mean, something as normal as a common cold was an issue for Spider-Man in an early storyline. I mean, and nobody had ever done anything like that before. I will say that a few of the villains in some strips like Giant Man were just totally absurd and over the top. And there were a few campy moments at Marvel. I think the one thing that Marvel does get a big shout out in my book with is Not Brand Echh. Mm-hmm. That's where, they did this wonderful parody comic. And as the story is told there, that, Roy Thomas is one of the people behind creating it. And Roy's vision with Gary Friedrich, they wanted to do spoofs of other people's stuff and DC's characters and such. But, Stan Lee says, no, let's make fun of our own. And, how cool was that? That just showed everyone that Marvel did have a sense of humor about themselves as well. So, yeah, I'm sure there probably were a few campy moments along the way that I could have included in Hero-a-Go-Go, but again, I just largely avoided most of Marvel comics because I kind of thought that they just really weren't a part of the camp movement, even though they were coming out during the camp era.
Yeah. And, as you said, they do poke fun at themselves with Not Brand Echh, but it's always seemed to me that Marvel, and I was not a Marvel kid growing up reading the comics. I always gravitated toward things like definitely DC, Harvey and a lot of the others. But with Marvel, I mean, they took themselves seriously, maybe not too seriously, because what they were doing in their own way was serious business. The other publishers really couldn't meet up with that, as you pointed out. And so maybe one answer to that is to kind of intentionally try to do what we call camp now, right? So where you have your Batman, you have the Dial H for Hero, and other such titles that are just kind of fun and you really can't take too seriously. You can have a good laugh at. So that's what they were left with. And if there were publishers, let's say like Harvey with their Harvey Thrillers, where they wanted to be serious, but they came across as campy. Well, that was unintentional.
Yeah.
But with the Marvel folk, I mean, they were doing something right. They were on a roll, and they were serious about it.
They were, absolutely. So again, that is really why there is the absence of most Marvel characters in the book. Again, and just to be very clear too, as you see and you understand, Derek, again, this is not a Silver Age comics history by any stretch. This is really looking at camp. Mm-hmm. And again, I just didn't feel that most of what Marvel was doing really belonged under that designation. Mm.
Now, you've mentioned a few of the chapters or sections in this book that really stood out to you when you were writing this. But I'm wondering if you can, and this may be like asking someone to choose among a favorite child, but or a favorite among your various children. But are there characters or properties when you were writing this book that stood out to you to the point that you're really drawn to that, characters that you maybe have a long history with that are just special places in your heart?
Well, I've already mentioned a few. I mean, Metamorpho I absolutely adored. I really enjoyed Dial H for Hero without realizing earlier when I was reading those stories as a kid, I didn't realize I was really reading DC's version of the original Captain Marvel. But in a way, that was part of the inspiration, a boy who could become superheroes. Instead of a magic word, it was a mystery dial. But, I really loved the Inferior Five and Not Brand Echh both. Those made me laugh as a kid. And as I was rereading these stories as an adult, I was laughing again. There's one issue of Inferior Five in particular, issue number 6, where E. Nelson Bridwell, the writer, really puts DC's staff and politics under this microscope and does it in a fashion where he got one in over his coworkers. He really took some jabs at them without them really being aware of it, because he did it in such a fashion that it looks broad and that they're in on the joke. But he got a few interesting jabs at some people in there for their behaviors, which I just find funny today, knowing a little more about comic book history and having now read more about some of the personalities. Well, another thing I was really passionate about, something that I absolutely adored during my childhood that I got the opportunity to cover in the book, was the Hanna-Barbera characters of the 60s, the television characters, most of which have been in comic books very recently through DC Comics series Future Quest. Mm-hmm. But Johnny Quest in particular, I loved that show. That was just a fabulous cartoon. It was a primetime cartoon. The original, one season of Johnny Quest. Now later it got rebooted, but the original season of Johnny Quest, one season of episodes was 1964 to 1965, produced for primetime on Friday evenings. And because of that, Doug Wildey, the cartoonist who was hired to develop the show and the look of the show, was given more license to up the violence, because it was competing against a lot of nighttime shows, cop shows, private eye shows, westerns that had a higher level of violence than you would find on a traditional Saturday morning cartoon. And so that's why there are people who die in Johnny Quest episodes. They die off camera. There's some stuff there that's just a lot of explosions that you normally wouldn't find on your traditional Saturday morning cartoon, including the other Hanna-Barbera cartoons. There's a lot of explosions, but stuff usually kind of happen off screen, They're cleverly constructed to where violence is downplayed but implied, sort of like some of the horror and graphic nature of Hitchcock movies. There's so many people swear to you that they saw knife penetration into Janet Leigh's body in the shower scene in Psycho when there was none of that whatsoever. There was just a knife going up and down, her screaming, blood trickling into the drain. These are all camera tricks, and Hanna-Barbera was really good at that. As I went back and looked at these Hanna-Barbera cartoons as well, again, and really looked at them with the gosh wow factor of being a grade schooler, long in the past, I realized how effective they were with the use of gimmickry and their limited budgets. But, the animation in Johnny Quest, for example, is really pretty rudimentary, but the drawing is phenomenal. So you are tricked into thinking that the show is a lot better animated than it really is because it looks so darn good. But when you really watch it, there's some stock imagery, and you see some replayed action bits from here and there. Mm-hmm. Probably the greatest offender of that is not a Hanna-Barbera, but the Spider-Man cartoon of the 60s. I mean, I love that cartoon, but out of a 7-minute episode, it seemed like there's about 2 minutes of Spider-Man swinging.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and on his web, and it was the same shot, So they were recycling that, and that was really on a shoestring budget. And as Ralph Bakshi says, he came along in season 3 and was on an even shorter leash. But to go back to Hanna-Barbera, those characters were just dynamite. I love the Impossibles. I mean, Adam Ant, Secret Squirrel, that stuff was just a lot of fun. But Shazam, the Herculoids, Mighty Mightor, they literally had a universe of characters and who appeared to some degree in comic books as well.
Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Again, the Hanna-Barbera stuff, hits it's a point with me as well on the nostalgia factor, and also things that I continue to enjoy whenever I see them. And I was curious though about in your Banana Splits section on in that chapter, Camp Run Amok, where you deal with the media as a whole. Mm-hmm. The Banana Splits don't come up, and I can't remember, but do you mention them in the Bandcamp section?
I don't. They came a little later to the game, didn't they? I think they were more like a 1968, 69 type entry.
Yeah.
And so they really were, if they were to be considered part of the camp era, I guess they came very late to the party. And, interestingly, to go back to DC Comics, DC not only has published Future Quest, but just a couple of weeks ago they released 4 one-shots that teamed DC characters with kind of variants of Hanna-Barbera characters, and Banana Split Suicide Squad was one of them. And I haven't gotten that yet, but I'm just curious. I think I need to read that. That just sounds so bizarre. But
yes.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily snub Banana Splits intentionally, but I just kind of felt that they came in so late that they really weren't part of that movement. The other characters, and I can't believe I did not mention Space Ghost earlier. The crown jewel there of the Hanna-Barbera universe. That character is so iconic and has had so many leases on life, even the comedic version,
right.
Of the talk show. But that character is so classic, and the costume design so simplistic to where they haven't messed with it at all. Mm-hmm. It's one of those costumes that, Carmine Infantino's costume design for the Silver Age Flash. Now, it's been modified a lot, but still, you even look at what you see on the Flash TV show on the Grant Gustin, what's his name? Gustin, on the CW. And you could still say, okay, well, that's a modernized version of Carmine's suit, but they have never touched Space Ghost's suit, his design, because it's perfect. Mm-hmm. There is nothing to change. It's simple, it's scary, but it's not. It's he's wearing an executioner's mask, a hood, but there's something that's all so calming about him, and maybe it's the white and yellow that are warmer or lighter, brighter colors. And when you juxtapose that against the darkness of space, the character pops. But the fact that he was also a father figure, but that eerie music, ooh, I mean, that was creepy, but not so scary that you wanted to go hide underneath the bed or anything. Now, some of my friends who grew up with the camp era, who aren't comics people like you or I have seen a few of my Facebook posts over the past year talking about this book, and I was posting some Johnny Quest images, and I had a few friends who were, college professors or high school teachers today who were saying, "Oh, the robot spy episode scared the crap out of me when I was a kid." And that's the one, of course, with the eye, with the spider legs that walked around trying to get some plans from Dr. Quest. But that one really scared people for Johnny Quest. But it's interesting how these cartoons imprinted people and how 50 years later they will look back and realize that was really an important part of their youth.
Yeah. Getting back to the banana splits, you see, I've always seen them as, if you're going to place them within the camp, so to speak, it's like maybe a ramped up kind of camp, because if the Monkees were parodies of the Beatles on television, then the Banana Splits were parodies of the Monkees. So it's like a parody of a parody, right? Or you could even say an homage to an homage if you'd rather. But it just kind of gives another twist to that screw.
That's very true. That's very true. Again, just because they started so late, I really didn't even consider them, quite frankly. I grew up loving the Banana Splits. I'm guessing, and again, this is an educated guess and not to be taken as gospel, but I mentioned Mark Boger earlier. He's doing another book for TwoMorrows called Groovy, which looks at all this psychedelic, type culture, and it kind of will, in a way, pick up where I left off. And I dare say, he might include the Banana Splits, because that just seems like that would be part of that era, because they were really, infused with the psychedelic culture too, the watered down psychedelic culture that you also saw in the Brady Bunch, with the big daisies and the flowers and the paisley, patterns and that kind of stuff too. So So you might get a chance to see them in a TwoMorrows book.
Okay, something else to look forward to.
There you go.
Now, you were talking about some of your favorite sections of the book. If I could, let me tell you one of my favorites. And this appears in that third chapter, Campus Clowns. In fact, I think that has to be my favorite chapter of the entire book, just because of the comedy and the figures that you cover. But also, largely because you spend a lot of time on Jerry Lewis. And how could I not? That's right. How could I not? But yeah, I mean, he was asking for it. Yeah, he hung out with superheroes repeatedly. But go ahead. I'm sorry. No, I'm a big fan of Jerry Lewis, my co-host on the review show of the Comics Alternative. He's a big Jerry Lewis fan. We bring him up all the time on this podcast. So when I saw as much space as you devoted to Jerry Lewis, I thought, okay, that's it. This is definitely a book that everyone has to read. So could you tell us a little bit about the way that Jerry Lewis figures into your concept of camp through the superheroes, but also just otherwise? Well, Jerry Lewis was connected to campy superheroes in more than any other figure, with the possible exception of LBJ. But Jerry Lewis, there was a movie he and Dean Martin did called Artists and Models, where Jerry was a comic book fan, and Dean was a comic book artist, and Shirley MacLaine played Bat Lady, and so that predated
any of the Jerry Lewis superhero team-ups that I get into with the Jerry Lewis comic book that DC published. Jerry was the first popping head, so to speak, on the Batman TV show, the first guy to stick his head out of a window and talk to the dynamic duo. Jerry Lewis played Sad Sack in the movies. And then, as I write in the book, there were 5 different superhero issues of parodies in the Jerry Lewis comic book. The Adventures of Jerry Lewis was the full title, of course, that DC Comics published for a real long time, a surprisingly long time. The first was a takeoff of Spider-Man, and then, which was rare because Spider-Man had only been around for a year or so. And it was kind of a subtle takeoff that they did at DC because DC was still kind of, I think they kind of felt above that kind of thing back then. DC was a little stodgier, you know. That was the company where you had the literary types as editors who had the tweed jackets with the elbow patches and they smoked pipes and that kind of thing, where you had the beatniks running the joint over at Marvel, you know. But they did. Arnold Drake and Bob Oxner, the creative team, poked fun of Spidey and an issue with Jerry Lewis. But then came the team-ups. 4 issues of Jerry Lewis published over about a 2 to 3 year period, where Jerry met different characters in the DC universe, the first being Batman and Robin. And that was right in the height of the Batman TV show Mania, and it's a wicked parody. It's very funny. The second was Superman. The third was The Flash. And the fourth was Wonder Woman. And oddly enough, and that one came really at the end of the camp era. And the first 3 are pretty solid and pretty funny. I will say that the fourth one is really hard to defend. It also was the era of Wonder Woman when Wonder Woman was depowered and turned into essentially, you know, Emma Peel from the Avengers, the British Avengers. So it was Diana. I was about to say Diana Ross. Excuse me, Diana Prince. Yeah,
another '60s Diana.
There you go. But Diana Prince as Wonder Woman. So Jerry met her, and this is another story where, excuse me, where they weren't paying attention to continuity whatsoever. They just kind of wrote this one off in a vacuum. But it was just bizarre. Jerry even disguises himself as an Amazon, so you get to see Jerry in drag. It was a really weird story. But these stories were just fun overall, and that essay is called Jerry Lewis One-Man Justice League. So, yeah, he was involved with all of this stuff, so how could I not give him that much ink? I had to. He was just asking for it. These stories were great. The best of the batch, though, was the Batman crossover that had the Joker, and the Penguin and Riddler were in there as well, but the Joker's on the cover. I actually have, it's something that I acquired when I was an editor at DC Comics. I have the actual cover proof from that issue of The Adventures of Jerry Lewis. I was at DC from the late 80s to the mid-90s, and when we moved out of 666 Fifth Avenue, there was this great purging of stuff from the office, and there was just stuff being dumped out in the hallway. So there's a cover proof for that issue, which I've had framed. And so, yeah, it's just, I love that comic as a kid, and it was a heck of a lot of fun to reread as an adult, and it was a pleasure to write about it as well. The writer and artist are both passed, so I couldn't ask any questions. But they had both talked about it in previously published interviews, so I was able to get their perspective on some of this material and share some of that.
Yeah, you know, it may not ever happen, but I do wish that at some point, and it may be after Jerry Lewis's death, that DC will collect the past, you know, first Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis comics, and then Adventures of Jerry Lewis. I would love to see those archived, collected.
Well, they're beautifully drawn. You know, they are. I mean, Oxner, from the era that I know, who did them before him? Did Mort Drucker do some?
I'm not sure.
And I'm really not well versed in those earlier issues. There was another artist, though, I think that predated Oxner, and his name is escaping me right now. but they're just beautifully drawn, and they were kind of clever. They obviously were a part of a movement to sort of compete with TV and movies at a time, beginning in the late 50s and through the early 60s, where televisions started to cut into comic books market share. So DC in particular, as well as Dell Gold Key, they were aggressive about acquiring media properties as TV tie-ins. And so, as seen on TV, you'll read it as a comic book. But what they did with Jerry Lewis and Bob Hope were kind of trick you in a way. They were humor comics, but they also drew these really vivacious, sexy women to where, people who appreciated good girl art had a reason to buy the comic as well. Mm-hmm. And those are the people, I think, today who are going back. However few there are people who are collecting those, and I think they're really doing it maybe even more so from the art and the good girl art perspective than the actual content. I'm surprised that over the years, even back when Lewis was in his MDA telethon heyday, that there was never some type of collection. It's one of those things to where, I don't know, as each year passes, you distance yourself from the target audience so much that I just wonder if a collection will ever take place. How long did it take for the Batman TV series to be released on, DVD and Blu-ray? I mean, it was never released on VHS, and it took so long, essentially, 5 decades, that the lion's share of the cast was no longer around to do any peripheral material for the releases. I go into a lot of antique stores because I just love that old stuff. And I see stuff now that's collecting dust, like Hopalong Cassidy and Howdy Doody, things that were, the generation before ours. But the people who appreciate that are mostly gone. And those are not perennial characters. They've never been reintroduced for another generation, so they are fading away.
Yeah.
But Batman won't. He keeps getting rebooted. Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer, the chances of there being an appreciation for him 50 years from now, they're pretty slim. I think that, my piece on him that I wrote is probably going to be his last moment in the sun, but I'm happy to do it because that was a charming book, too, to throw out another example at you. That was a discovery for me. I knew that it existed, but I had never read any Fat Man comics. They were actually a little harder to find back in 1967 when those 3 issues were released, because Lightning Comics, the publisher, was one of those fly-by-nights that came along during the camp craze. And but it was Otto Bender and C.C. Beck, the main talents behind the Golden Age Captain Marvel. And this was witty and beautifully drawn and hilariously written and quite campy in a smart way. Mm-hmm. And and I really appreciated them as an adult reader. But the likelihood of them ever having a renaissance is I guess not existent. But I'm glad I had a chance to rediscover them, and for the people who remember Fat Man, and for people who will be discovering them through my book, and I'm glad to be able to share that.
You mentioned Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer, and that reminds me, you cover a lot of heroes in this book, and villains as well, that are on the kind of weird, strange, why the hell did they come up with something like that side of comicsdom, primarily superhero genre. Characters like, Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer, Sinestro Boy Fiend, the Captain Marvel, and not the one that many people think about.
Split.
Yes, Split, yeah. Buona Beast, and even, the Junk Heap era Blackhawks. It seems to me that over the past few years, we have had, I don't know if you want to call it a resurgence, but it could be a coincidental bubbling up of these kind of weird heroes. And, your book comes out next week. About a month or so ago, John Morris put out his book, The Legion of Regrettable Supervillains, which was a follow-up to 2015's League of Regrettable Superheroes. And then earlier this year, Craig Yo put out the first of his, what I think may be 2-volume collection of super weird heroes. And I think that your Hero-a-Go-Go, even though you're dealing with a more specific subject matter, kind of fits in to this bubbling up.
I would actually look at us as all 3 or now 4 with the supervillains book as being in the same family in a way. I think that the other books cut they survey a wider era. There's a lot of Golden Age characters and such that are in those books as well, are there not? And the characters that Craig found too are just like wow, mind blowing. That as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, nobody ever sets out to do a bad comic book, but you wonder in a few cases if that really wasn't their intention. With the people wearing G-strings, what is this? This is bizarre. But again, mine has more of a narrow focus, or not a narrow, but a specific focus on that era of the mid '60s, where this was the flavor du jour, where everybody was doing this stuff, and it was definitely a movement. And some people were doing it better than others.
Why do you think it is that within the past 2 years that the 3 of you have come out with these 4, and what will soon later this year be 5 books that deal with like strange heroes and unbelievable heroes?
Good question. I don't know. Maybe the real world keeps handing us so much bizarre news that that these guys are seeming pretty normal. And it also could be that the respective ages of each of us, looking at this material too. That we just sort of realize that it's time to treat these characters with a spotlight and to kind of have a little fun with them. I, again, have fun with my characters, but I don't necessarily target them. A lot of stuff that you can find a lot of the characters that I've written about, or some of the characters I've written about in Hero-a-Go-Go, blogged about online, but as I've read some of those things over the years, I find that the tone is a little more hostile, almost what the heck type attitude too. And I think that the social media and the internet certainly has grown a level of snarkiness, which is really kind of the main tone that most people communicate in today. And I could understand someone from a generation younger than mine looking at Dell's Dracula and Frankenstein comics and thinking that they're horrific and the worst comics ever. And however, you have to understand the time that these characters were created under to really understand the characters. So some degree of appreciation of history, I think, is crucial when you're analyzing this type of material. So I think all the authors that you mentioned have that and bring that to their packages. And it is kind of curious, though, that these books are all coming out at around the same time. So hopefully we can all complement and support each other. And I hope that is the case, that we are finding this audience, that we don't overburden our poor audience with this type of material.
Yeah.
But each of us, though, and our respective credits as well, look at different things within our books and also handle them in different voices and from different perspectives, too. So, you might find a character in more than one book, but the way that character is evaluated is going to be very different, a different experience each time out.
Right. Now, you're continuing your work as editor of Back Issue. This was a really large project that you're just about to get out the door. Is there something else right now that you're working on that you can tell us about? I
can give you a hint.
Okay.
Yeah, I have just signed an agreement with John Morrow. We are going to do another magazine in addition to my doing Back Issue. And I cannot tell you what it's about, but I can tell you that if you like Back Issue and you like Hero-a-Go-Go, you will be interested in this magazine. So that's a teaser.
Okay.
But that's all I can say at this point. I eventually want to do another book for TwoMorrows that is not necessarily a follow-up to Hero-a-Go-Go, but it would cover the next major movement in comics. And I've already talked to John Morrow about this, although between Back Issue, this new magazine, and a few other things that I do and I'm working on, I won't have time to start this for a while, but I want to do a book on the relevance movement of comics of the late 60s through the early 70s, where comics got a social conscience. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of my rite of passage from childhood to adolescence. So with a torch being passed between the campiness of my childhood to the social awareness of my adolescence, and it happened through comic books. I thanked Denny O'Neil years ago when I was interviewing him for a book I did called The Justice League Companion, which was essentially a lot of oral histories and such from Justice League creators. I thanked him for really helping me form my social conscience when I was a kid in the late 60s and early 70s, especially with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, but even through a few of the Justice League stories that he did that were starting to tackle things like overpopulation and pollution, things like that, through the context of superhero stories. And those were really eye-opening for me. And, being a kid here in the South in the late 60s and early 70s, I had a very conservative upbringing. But through Green Lantern, Green Arrow, I basically, and then through Archie and Bunker and Mike Stivic on All in the Family,
mm-hmm.
Through pop culture, I started to get some back and forth between liberals and conservatives, which opened my mind and my perspective, and also enabled me to grow an appreciation and understanding of both sides, which a lot of people don't have anymore. I really feel like I'm one of the few people left in the middle who just really wants people to start talking to each other across this divide. We just seem to get more and more polarized. But, we withstood all this stuff, the Hawk and Dove movement of the 60s and, Watergate. We've withstood a lot of stuff, but we don't seem to be getting there today. But I digress. I apologize. But I do want to look at the relevance movement because I think it was crucial. And I really think it helped comics grow up to the betterment and to some degree the harm of comics, because when comics lost their innocence, I don't think they've ever really regained it. And, bleakness and, hyper-realistic material just seems to be the norm, and anti-heroes, which were the fringe. When The Punisher and Wolverine came out, they were exciting and cool because you hadn't seen anything like that before, and they started to, push the boundaries and how far would they go, that type of thing. But now it's like, sheesh, Superman broke a guy's neck in Man of Steel. It's like, how far will they keep going? Doesn't anybody hold the beacon of light anymore? Now I'm sounding like a disgruntled middle-aged guy who just, wants something happy again. I don't want to see Batman Batusi. No, please, Ben Affleck, do not Batusi. But nonetheless, I would like to see a little bit of a glimmer of hope from some of the heroes that we see out there today, and I'm not really getting it, with the exception of things that are more retro-skewed, like the Batman 66 comic, or my friend Andy Mangels is writing his dream project now, Wonder Woman 77 meets the Bionic Woman. This guy was born to write that, and he's doing a fun job bringing these characters together. And that's the type of stuff that I find myself reading in the comic book business today, industry today. I will occasionally pick up something new, and there's a lot of wonderful stuff out there, but, as far as the mainstream is concerned, I've just kind of aged out. I'm reading Commandy challenge right now, which is kind of fun. But that's a throwback to an 80s round-robin series that DC did. So
Right.
I'm definitely kind of mired into, appreciating what I grew up with and revisiting that upon occasion.
Mm-hmm. So this book comes out next week, Hero-a-Go-Go,
Correct.
and I do recommend that our listeners go out and get a copy. Not only is it packed full of information, the kind of things that we've been talking about during this interview, but also I really appreciate the design. And this is something that I have come to really enjoy and appreciate from TwoMorrows, and that is the way that they combine, not only informative text, right? Really substantive material, along with color, with images, with photographs. And that's something you don't find in a lot of books like this. And I think that the design is a big part of what TwoMorrows does.
I agree, across the board. And the publications look great. And I appreciate the fact that you brought that up, because it gives me an opportunity to sing the praises of my designer on this book, Scott Saavedra. He's a cartoonist who, when John said, "Would you like for Scott to design the book?" I said, "Oh, heck yeah," because he gets it. He gets it. And I think if someone were younger, they might learn to get it, but I thank Scott for bringing my childhood to life when he was working on my book, and he said, "Hey, man, it's my childhood too." And so that just warmed my heart to hear him say that, because he understood the philosophy, what graphics work, what graphics don't work. That poor guy had a burden, because I slammed him with so much art to try to make it all fit. We had to chop a little bit out of the book. Yeah, there were a few things that didn't make the final cut. There was going to be a full-on section of lyrics from songs, theme songs. There were a few that made it into the inside back cover, but there was going to be a sing-along, and we just didn't have room. I had this a couple of great cover galleries that we just didn't have room for. Surfing and comics. There's a section on surfing and comics, but I had a cover gallery. Come on, Magilla Gorilla on a surfboard, And there was also a section, a cover gallery that I had to cut with all these one-hit wonders from Archie comics, because back when Archie was really doing a lot of spoofs on superheroes, they would have, this is a superhero on the cover, a generic hero you'd never see again. And a few of them had names like Giant Man, too, that they had borrowed from somewhere else or whatever. But, I had a full gallery of those, but we just did not have the space. It's 272 pages. It feels like it weighs a ton, but it's just a ton of love and fun, and I am privileged and honored to have done it. I had a blast, and I really hope my readers enjoyed as much as I did.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you again for being on the Comics Alternative. I've had a great time talking with you, and
Thank
as
you,
I
Derek.
said at the opening,
too.
It's great to talk to another native North Carolinian.
Thank you as well. It's been a lot of fun talking to a Tar Heel. Thanks for your time.
I want to thank Michael Eury for taking the time and talking with me on the Comics Alternative. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did too. And if you want to get your copy of his new book, Hero-a-Go-Go, then you can find it in fine bookstores, including Amazon.com. In fact, why don't you go to comicsalternative.com/Amazon, and there you'll see a link to our Amazon Associates account. Click on that and search for Michael Eury's Hero-a-Go-Go, and if you buy the book that way, then you will also be helping the Comics Alternative. You can also get great books at our sponsor for this episode, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Michael Eury. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can get in touch with us via email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over the social media sphere, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com. We've got a lot of great programming lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those shows. Until then, I'm Derek, and I will be podcasting with you later.